Добрый день, дорогие участники! Рады приветствовать вас на Limmud Unlimited. Эта программа организована московским Limmudом. Сегодня у нас сессия Скотта Хейзелхёрста «Поиск колен израилевых. Взгляд из ЮАР». Модератором сегодня буду я, меня зовут Нелли, и я помогу сделать так, чтобы вы не чувствовали себя одиноко, и чтобы Скотту было с кем при необходимости поговорить в прямом эфире. Я буду просматривать ваши вопросы и самые актуальные и интересные задавать спикеру в процессе сессии и в конце. Спикер Скотт попросил, чтобы, если у вас есть какой-то вопрос по содержанию сессии, если вы чего-то не поняли, если вы хотите прояснить какие-то его слова, то, пожалуйста, задайте его в чате во время сессии. А если у вас есть вопрос более спорного характера, если вы хотите спросить что-то более обширное, если вы с чем-то не согласны, то, пожалуйста, оставьте этот вопрос на конец сессии, когда спикер будет на них отвечать. Итак, чтобы нам было комфортно взаимодействовать, я расскажу немного о функционале зума. Ваше видео выключено, но звук включен. Как мы уже сказали, вы можете задавать свои вопросы спикеру в чате. Если вы зашли с компьютера, это кнопка «Подробнее» и «Чат». Если вы присоединились к нам со смартфона, это кнопка «Участники» и «Чат», а на некоторых смартфонах «Подробнее» и «Чат». Давайте протестируем с вами возможности нашего чата. Поставьте, пожалуйста, напишите в чате «плюс», если вам хорошо видно и если вам хорошо слышно. Отлично, у нас появились уже некоторые плюсы. Прекрасно. Замечательно, спасибо вам большое. Прекрасно. Итак, вы, конечно, можете задать формат просмотра. Если вы в правом верхнем углу включите формат просмотра видеоспикера. И, наконец, давайте поговорим о наших языках сегодня. Это очень важно. Скотт из Южноафриканской республики, и он будет проводить сессию на английском языке. Поэтому мы пригласили сегодня на сессию переводчика, Дарью Носовицкую. Большое спасибо ей за то, что она согласилась нам переводить. Она будет делать синхронный перевод. Но синхронный перевод будет не для всех, а только для тех, кому он необходим. Поэтому давайте посмотрим вниз вашего экрана, где находится значок, похожий на глобус. Если нажать на него, да, все правильно, если нажать на него, то появится меню, где надо выбрать русский перевод. Если вы присоединились к нам с телефона, то, как мы писали сегодня ранее, у вас должна быть новая версия Zoom. Именно она позволяет включать и выключать перевод. Мы надеемся, что вы скачали последнюю версию, и поэтому тоже видите кнопку перевода и сможете ее нажать при необходимости. Протестируйте, пожалуйста, те, кому это необходимо, кому необходим перевод, протестируйте эту кнопку, и если удалось, тоже можно поставить плюс в чате. Работает. Прекрасно. Очень хорошо. Отлично. Большое вам спасибо. И сейчас мы начинаем нашу сессию. Scott, we are ready to start, so would you please join us?
Hello, Nelly, and hello, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak and to be here. It's a great honor, and I think it's one of the perhaps only advantage of this current crisis is that it's made us make links with people we otherwise wouldn't have, and that we're able at different parts of the world to still talk about something that is of interest to us all and come together in some way, even though it's physically apart. Should I start the talk?
Yeah.
Sorry, just give me a minute. Is it all good from your side?
Everything is good.
Good. Okay, then I'll start.
Yeah.
So the title of my talk was Jewish History and Identity Through the Lens of DNA, but the organizers didn't really like it, and they added as a title, Search for the Tribes of Israel. And that took me a little while to think about to see whether I really liked it. But after some reflection, I actually think it does capture the spirit of what I am talking about, because what I'm talking about is the search for identity and the way in which people understand themselves and each other. And in this context, I'm talking about people who are looking for Jewish heritage. So I'm going to be talking about how DNA can be used for this, the big advantages that it has, as well as some of the risks. This is based on a talk that I gave at Limmud in Johannesburg, and I hope you find it interesting and worthwhile. So I work at the university in Johannesburg at an institute which is primarily looking at research for genetic causes of disease using DNA evidence. And we also use the same data to try and understand population diversity and history. And it's been a very powerful technique in both of these respects. So for us, the revolution in DNA technology and the very rapid decrease in the cost of DNA sequencing has been a real benefit to our research. It has completely revolutionized the way in which we do research and has made things possible that otherwise would not have been possible. But there are risks. So even though it's very positive technology, it can, like many other technologies, be abused if we don't do it carefully. And the central theme that I want to get across is, although we can use this DNA evidence to understand the history of different human populations, we need to understand that our DNA, either as individuals or as groups, is a consequence of our histories, and it doesn't define who we are. So my DNA reflects who my parents are, who my ancestors were, a little bit about how they interacted, but it doesn't necessarily define my identity. So although I think that's agreed by almost all scientists in this area, unfortunately, we've started to see the use of this technology precisely to try to define the cultural identity of individuals for a variety of reasons. And I've got two examples on the slide here that I found over the last few years, one from the Times of Israel and one from Haaretz, where the technology is being used by official or semi-official organizations to try to prove the Jewishness or non-Jewishness of individuals. And I have to say, both as a scientist and as a Jew, I find this extremely offensive. And I think it's invalid. One can only imagine how this technology would have been used by the Nazis in the 1930s and 40s, or in my country in South Africa in the 60s and 70s, if it had been available. And the increased misery it would have brought tens of thousands of people if this had been used in such a crude way. So I'm very much opposed to the idea of trying to define individual identity or belonging to a group through the use of DNA technology. One of the other risks of DNA is that there's obviously, in the last 100 years or more, we've seen many people try to justify racism through pseudoscience and through pseudobiology. And of course, the use of DNA is just one more weapon that people can abuse to try to come up with arguments about why other people are inferior or why they are superior. And of course, that's wrong. Then I do need to warn you that the data is incomplete, it's error-prone, there's new data coming available. All the methods that we have are statistical in nature, and sometimes they allow for different answers. And there's lots of disagreements in the field. So I'm going to, in my talk, try to summarize what I think is a fair summary of the majority view in the field, but I'm going to have to simplify, and perhaps I'll do some people an injustice. And always when you simplify, you lose something. So please be aware of that. Moreover, and this will be another part of my talk, is that they're not just risks in wrong interpretations of the data, actually the risks in correct interpretations, both at an individual level and as a group level. So one example I have is a colleague of mine who was involved in a large European study that recruited several tens of thousands of people, and they discovered a fair number of individuals in their study were born out of incestuous relationships. So you can imagine how damaging that would be to the individuals concerned or to their families if that was not known by them or by their families, to be suddenly told the truth based upon the DNA evidence. So there's a very clear example of the risk of correct interpretations. But I think there also are risks at a group level, and I'm going to give some examples in a Jewish context as we go along, because we will see that in some cases the DNA evidence may challenge the beliefs that a group of people have. And can discuss the advantages and disadvantages of that. So I will be focusing on genetic differences, but of course I need to emphasize that we are much more alike than different. There's huge variation within groups. There's no way of determining whether an individual belongs to a certain group or not from the DNA. And if we are interested in genetic differences, actually, if you look at the genes in the bacteria in our guts, there's more differences genetically between any pair of us in that DNA than in the human DNA that makes us up. So this is going to be the overview of my talk. I'm going to give a very quick overview of genetics. I'm going to give a lightning overview of history, which is always dangerous. And then I'm going to give some case studies of the use of DNA to illustrate some evidence about different groups. I'll look at the Kohanim and the Leviim and the Lembeh and the Ashkenazim as 3 different case studies. All good? Okay, so I'm going to give a lightning introduction to DNA. I know when I've given this talk before, there's always a mixed audience at Limmud, so some of you will be experts in this and will know more than I do because I'm actually a computer scientist by training. But I think some people will know something about DNA but don't quite understand how it all fits together. So I'm going to try to give some explanation of what DNA is. So DNA are chemical molecules that encode inherited biological function. And in our bodies, the DNA is collected, and each of our cells has a copy of this DNA. It's collected into what's called the genome, the collection of all of our DNA. And each of our cells has a copy of our genome. In fact, it has 2 copies of the genome, one that we've inherited from our mother and one that's been inherited from our father. So the most important parts of the genome are genes that determine particular behavior. So for example, one of the genes is called the LCT gene. And if we drink some milk or have dairy products, then through a relatively complex process, it produces an enzyme called lactase. And lactase is helped to digest the lactose in the milk and in the dairy products. And this is a nice example to use because in human populations, there's variation in the LCT gene. Originally, we think that the LCT gene in humans was such that after childhood, it wasn't switched on ever. So we weren't really able to digest dairy products. But over time, different human groups, particularly in Africa and Europe, acquired mutations that allows us still to digest milk and lactose after childhood. But lots of human groups don't have that mutation. And in fact, it's the case that many Ashkenazim do not have that mutation. And some people think that that's an argument for showing that at least a significant part of the ancestry of the Ashkenazim comes from outside of Europe because that mutation is fairly common in Europe. So our DNA is collected into this genome. And for the purpose of this talk, we're going to divide the genome into 3 parts. The majority of it is called the autosomal DNA. It's about 97% of all the DNA. And that's the part where we each have 1 copy from our mother and 1 copy from our father. Then men have a Y chromosome, small part of the DNA, only about 1%. And this is inherited only from the father. So women don't have it, and we only inherit it from our father. And the mitochondrial DNA, which is a very small but still very important part of our DNA, is inherited only from mother to child. So everyone has mitochondrial DNA, but we've only inherited it from mother to child. So why are the Y chromosome and the mitochondrial DNA important? Well, if we look at my mitochondrial DNA and I compare it to my mother's, it's going to likely be exactly the same as my mother's mitochondrial DNA, which is probably exactly the same as her mother's mitochondrial DNA, and so on and so forth back into the past. Many, many, many generations. So we can go back 20 generations, and that great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother of mine, her mitochondrial DNA would be not identical, but almost exactly the same as mine. So this mitochondrial DNA gives me a way of sharply looking back into the past at one of my ancestors. And the same thing is true on the paternal side. So if I look at the Y chromosome, it's the same as my father's, my grandfather's, my great-grandfather's. Occasionally, every now and then, there's a mutation from one generation to the next. But again, I can go back into the past and I can look with fine detail at what I know what this one ancestor of mine, a part of his DNA looked like. Now, of course, these 2 ancestors, the father's father and mother's mother, are just 2 of the thousands of ancestors I had 20 generations ago. And biologically speaking, they're not more important than any of the other ancestors. Of course, as we'll see, culturally, it is important because, for example, we think Jewishness is transmitted through the mother's line, and certain castes are transmitted through the paternal line. But collectively, these two individuals are not more important than any of the others. So at an individual level, it doesn't really help you to know your mitochondrial or your Y chromosome DNA. It's people like me who it helps if I go into a community with some colleagues and we recruit several thousand people and we sequence their DNA, understanding what similarities and differences there are allows us not to tell us about the individual, but to tell us something about the group and the history of that group. And we'll see how that plays out in a Jewish context in a few slides' time. Then the autosomal DNA, which is the part of the DNA that's inherited 1 copy from the mother and 1 copy from the father, is more complex. It's a mosaic. It's a mix-up of all our ancestors' DNA. And in order to make sense of it, we need powerful statistical techniques, big computers to pick out the patterns, and we need lots of good data. But using this data, we're able to say a lot about populations' history, and I'm going to give you some examples in a minute. Are there any burning questions before I go on? Everyone good? Okay, so I've given you a lightning history of biology, and I'm now going to move on to something even more dangerous, to give you a lightning history of history. In 3 minutes to tell you something about the history of the Jews. You can tell that's a very dangerous thing to do, but I'm going to do it because I know from previous talks that I've given that not everyone has all the dates in their mind at the same time, and it's useful to have some simple picture of time and place before we go on. So we have some context for what I'm going to say. So about 70,000 years ago, modern humans left Africa. So I live down over here. And about 70,000 years ago, almost all modern humans were in Africa. They left Africa, and over the next 30 to 40,000 years, spread across the world in a complex and wonderful and probably bloody way. And this takes us to the history of the area that we're particularly interested, this area of the Middle East. And there were two big events that happened about 25,000 years ago and 10,000 years ago as this area of the Middle East and the Levant was settled. So let me say what I mean about the Levant, because I'm going to use the term quite often, the Levant or Levantine. It's a very approximate term. It means this geographical region over here, rather than the broader Middle East. So the Levant means today would be parts of Turkey, parts of Syria, Lebanon, Israel, the Palestinian territories, part of Jordan. Sometimes people include Cyprus as well. So this area is the Levant, which is different, but part of the broader Middle East. So about 20,000 years ago, there's a separation in the population from the broader Middle East to the Levant, and about 10,000 years ago, from a Levantine population to a broader European population. Now, when I say separation, I don't mean there's a clear cut, because obviously that's not true. There's always interaction between different groups, and the population of Europe changes quite dramatically over this period of time, as well as this region over here. But nevertheless, we can start to pick out that these different populations start to diverge, and we can see differences at a population level. And by 1000 BCE, so that's 3,000 years ago in this region, we have the rise of the Israelite kingdoms. And a few hundred years ago, a few hundred years later, about 2,500 years ago, they fall. We get to this date, 586 BCE, which is the most important date in Jewish history, at least at a population genetic level, because from this point in time onwards, the majority of Jews live outside the Levant. And in fact, for the vast majority of time, the vast majority of Jews live outside of the Levant. And that means that they get exposed to different living environments. And more importantly, they get exposed to different neighboring populations and have different types of interaction with them. And so we start to see differences in these populations over time as there is intermarriage between these populations. And that process continues. So even after the fall of the Babylonian Empire and Jews are allowed to go back to the Levant, back to Israel, we start to see this diaspora right across this region from Spain in the west all the way to this region into Iraq, Iran of today in the east. And that process continues after the fall of the Second Temple and through the later part of the Roman Empire. So that by the fall of the Roman Empire, we have significant diaspora living right across this whole region from Arabia into Spain. And I'm going to come back to this point later on. So that's where I'm going to end my history. And I'm going to try to explain the DNA results in the light of this history. Now, part of the reason why I'm stopping here is because actually, for some Jewish groups, there's a gap in the history. So for the Ashkenazim, there's quite a long gap between now and when we start to learn about them later on. So I'm going to stop history for now and go on to talking about a little bit about the DNA evidence and what the DNA evidence tells us about the history of the Jews. So, what is the history? So let me sum it up on this slide. First of all, there's remarkable continuity. Despite long separation, many Jewish groups are more similar to each other than their host populations. And I'll show you examples of that now. And even when there are big differences, we are able to find that common ancestry that dates back 2,000 to 2,500 years. And that's quite remarkable, I think, given the disruptions of the last 2,000 years and the terrible persecutions that the Jewish peoples have endured. But of course, there are strong marks of links to other populations. No Jewish population was completely isolated. There were different times in history, quite significant intermarriage, and we'll see that. There are some exceptions. They're very interesting examples that if we had more time, I would speak about, but I'm afraid I'm going to simplify my talk and not cover them. So this picture over here is in a way a genetic map of the human race. So don't worry if you can't read it. I'm going to zoom in and look at some parts in more detail. I'm not expecting you can read it at this level, but we've got a human, this is a map of thousands of individuals across a whole range of human populations, grouped by their self-identity. So how people describe themselves. So as an example, I'm going to take this one because it's a nice big group. It's people who self-identify as Gujarati Indians. And what the colors represent is our statistical estimation of the ancestry of these individuals. So if we look at these Gujarati Indians, we see that actually we think that they are a mixture of two major Indian populations, which actually matches our understanding of history. There's a South Indian and a North Indian population that were quite distinct in history. And these Gujarati are a mixture of them. And we can see that a few of them have some small but significant other ancestry, which is actually more associated with European population. Notice also that there's a lot of diversity in the population. So this is representing about 100 different people. And we see that different people have different levels of admixture from the different groups. So although these signatures tell us something very interesting about the group as a whole, we must be careful not to jump to the conclusion that we can use the signature to define the individual. So let me now zoom in on this region over here, which is of interest to us. These groups, by the way, that are underlined are the ones where there is significant Jewish ancestry, and I'm going to look at some of them now. So I'm going to zoom in over here. I'm afraid the quality isn't good, but I'll tell you what you are seeing. So the Jewish populations over here are Sephardic Jews. So when I use the word Sephardic, I mean those Jews who are descendants of people who lived in Spain and Portugal before the 15th century, as opposed to Mizrahi and other Jews who lived in North Africa and the broader Middle East. So you can see that Sephardic Jews and Ashkenazi, and this is Ashkenazi Jews, they have a slightly different signature, but actually, even though they were genetically separated for probably 1,500 years, they are more similar to each other than other groups. So for example, if we compare them to other groups in the Middle East, Palestinians, Jordanians, or even the Druze, who they're closest to, there's a very different genetic signature. And another example I can give, it's perhaps not so clear, over here, there's a small number of Georgian Jews, and you can see this signature of the Georgian Jews is closer to the Sephardic and the Ashkenazi Jews than it is to the other Georgians. But of course, there's also the very strong signal of relationships that happened between neighboring groups over a long period of time. And also note there's significant diversity within these populations. Similarly, sorry, I'm jumping. If I compare the Ashkenazi and the Sephardic Jews to Europeans, there's a marked difference to, say, Western Europeans, French and Basques, Northern Europeans, Southern Europeans, and Eastern Europeans. So for example, Russians and Bulgarians. So even though these Ashkenazi populations were in Europe, either Western Europe or Eastern Europe for at least 1,000 years. And we definitely see the signs of that admixture. They've been able to keep, as a group, a distinct identity. This is a picture going the other way. I wanted just to show you some North African Jews, although it's not really part of the topic. So the one exception you'll see is Ethiopian Jews, which are quite similar to other Ethiopians. But other examples would be Yemeni Jews. There's actually a lot of diversity in Yemeni Jews, and they're quite different to most Yemeni people. And the other example would be, say, Iranian and Iraqi Jews, who are similar but markedly different as a whole, as a group, to other Iranians, despite Iranian Jews having been in Iran since the Babylonian times. So this is the data from the autosomal DNA. And I now want to move on and talk a little bit about what we can find out from the Y chromosome, the paternal DNA, and then later on, I'm going to come back and talk about the mitochondrial DNA. So the Y chromosome, remember, tracks the paternal line. And there's a little bit of jargon that I have to use, I'm sorry. The jargon we use is the Y haplogroup. And by that, we mean those men who share similar Y chromosomes. They're not identical, but they're very similar. And they indicate that the male ancestors, the father's father of those men, came from the same region at around the same time. So there are many, many haplogroups. It turns out that most Jews, Jewish men, are in haplogroups E, G, J, and Q, and J is the most common, and it's just an accident that it's J. It's got nothing to do with the word Jewish. It just happened to be the next letter available when they were naming the haplogroups. But it's true that many Jews have haplogroup J. So one of the first findings in this area was that, in fact, that both in Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews, that most male founders of these populations have Y haplogroups that came from the Middle East over 2,000 years ago. So if we follow the paternal line, fathers going back 2,000 to 2,500 years ago, we're going to find those ancestors living in the Levant and the broader Middle East. Not all of them, obviously there's a substantial minority who can trace their ancestry elsewhere, but the majority, both in the Sephardic and the Ashkenazim, have this quite distinct signature, which is not what you would expect from people who perhaps have not been living in that region for many thousands of years. We can also use the Y haplogroup information to explore a very important part of Jewish religious observance, in particular the Kohanim and the Leviim, the status of which is strictly through the patrilineal descent. So most people who observe this would not, for example, accept adoption. It has to be strictly through the patrilineal from father to son. Now, for religious purposes, we divide up Jewish men into three categories. Most Jewish men are what we would call Israelites. And roughly, or at least among the Ashkenazim, around 7% of them are Levites. And a smaller proportion, 1 to 3%, are Kohanim. So according to tradition, the Kohanim are the descendants of Aaron the high priest. The Levites are the descendants of Levi, the son of Jacob, one of the sons of Jacob. And Israelites are everyone else. Whether you can trace your ancestors back to Sinai or whether you're a convert, you are an Israelite. So what does the Y chromosome information tell us? So here's an interesting picture that I'm going to take you through. The details aren't so important. The top picture tells us about the haplogroups which the Israelites belong to. So that's most Jewish men fall in this category. About 90% of Jewish men fall in this category. And we can see in these charts the haplogroups to which they belong. You can see there's quite a spread right across. There's no one haplogroup that really stands out. There's a fair amount of agreement between the Ashkenazi and the non-Ashkenazi groups, but it's a fairly spread out. And as I said, most of these haplogroups come from the Middle East. We see a very different picture when we look at the Kohanim, at the Cohens. You'll see that roughly half of the Kohanim today, both Ashkenazi and non-Ashkenazi, belong to this one haplogroup that's called JP58 star. Sometimes I hear people talking about the Cohen gene. It's a terrible term, doesn't exist. It's a completely misleading and scientifically inaccurate. Now, this is, I think, a remarkable finding that you see 50% of a group of people who have a tradition, an oral tradition, that goes back over 2,000 years and shares this commonality. So I think this is strong evidence of a caste system and of a priesthood that goes back to Second Temple times, and something that has stayed remarkably consistent over a long period of time. Now, there is argument and disagreement about dating, about when these haplogroups arose. I think the majority view at the moment is that the agreement is that most people would say the origins of this are relatively old, 2,000 to 3,000 years. There are people who disagree with that. But nevertheless, it's interesting, and also that a lot of this diversity is relatively old. So we're not seeing this diversity of these other people over here arising because in recent time, people claim either knowingly or false or unknowingly that they're Kohanim when they're not Kohanim. Actually, there's diversity in ancient times. And that tells us something about our history. But we shouldn't overinterpret this for two reasons. First of all, of course, only half of the Kohanim have this JP58 star haplogroup. That means half of the Kohanim don't have that haplogroup. They can't both be right, right? If you believe strictly in the traditional interpretation, there is a huge problem here. And of course, there's nothing that says that even though this is the dominant haplogroup now, that this was the dominant haplogroup in Second Temple times. We know the few hundred years before the fall of the Second Temple, the priesthood was not really an example of good behavior of people that we would look at and say, this is how we should emulate our behavior today. So who knows what the dominant haplogroup was in Second Temple times. And moreover, although we see this signature in Kohanim, actually the JP58 star haplogroup is very common right across the Middle East. So in some parts of the Middle East, it's actually the dominant haplogroup. Now, it is true that there are subgroups of JP58 star which are still very common in the Kohanim and are much rarer in non-Jewish groups. But the view today is that we cannot really find a haplogroup that uniquely defines Jews or uniquely defines Kohanim. But maybe this is a debate we can have later on. And I want to talk about some consequences of this in a few slides on once I speak about another example. So what about the Levites? Now the Levites, remember, are the traditionally, by tradition, are the descendants of Levi. Now, for those of you who's perhaps are a bit rusty about the biblical stories, the Aaron was the great-grandson of Levi. So from a genetic point of view, we wouldn't expect there to be any difference in the Y chromosome of Aaron and Levi. So if a traditional interpretation is important to you, this is a problem. Because what we see in this chart over here which is what we call a principal component chart, which tries to map individuals that are close to each other genetically, close to each other in the picture. So this is a simplification, you'll understand. But as a whole, the Ashkenazi and Sephardic Kohanim cluster together as we would expect. And the Sephardic and the Ashkenazi Israelites cluster together as we expect. And the fact that they separated from the Kohanim is neither here nor there. But what we see is that the Sephardic Levites cluster with the Israelites rather than with the Kohanim. And if you look at the Ashkenazi Levites, you see they cluster here. These are different European populations, West, North, and East European populations. So the Ashkenazi Levites cluster with this East European population. Now, before we jump to conclusions, when this finding first came out, people immediately said, well, that shows in fact that the ancestor of the Ashkenazi Levites was European. But more recent research has shown that it's very likely that the ancestor of all the Ashkenazi Levites was Middle Eastern in origin. But this is the story. Today, there are roughly 300,000 Ashkenazi Levites. Of those, about 2/3 descend from one man born about 1800 years ago. And it's likely there was a single founder of the Ashkenazi Levites who arrived in Europe from the Levant. So there's a very interesting story that is definitely would be fascinating to know more about here. Now I'm going to go on, I'm going to change topics slightly. I'm going to come back to talk about the Ashkenazim in more detail because it's the main theme of the talk. But now we are discussing the Y chromosome. It's a convenient place to take a break and move to the story of the Lembeh, which is a group of people who live in Southern Africa. So I am in Johannesburg, which is over here, just below this red dot. And the Lembeh are a Bantu-speaking people who live right across Southern Africa. There are probably about 50,000 Lembeh in all, maybe a little bit more. And they're relatively varied today. So many are practicing Muslims or Christians. But in South Africa, there's an oral history of Jewish origin. And there's some Jewish customs. In fact, maybe I should have said many Jewish customs. So for example, there are dietary restrictions that we would clearly recognize as being similar or the same as restrictions that Jews have. They practice male circumcision at a young age. And they're endogenous. In other words, they marry within their group rather than outside their group. Now, despite the fact that they have this strong oral tradition of Jewish origin, and many Lembeh feel themselves as Jewish, they are not recognized by any of the mainstream Jewish groups. And that is something that is very hurtful to many of the Lembeh who feel they are being discriminated against. So here are a group of people who are a minority in the areas that they live in. So the Lembeh in South Africa, for example, live in a fairly rural part of the country, and they are a minority in the areas that they live, and they identify with Jewish people who don't recognize them as being Jewish. So their oral tradition is that they left Israel some 2,500 years ago, fall of the temple, and they came to Africa via Arabia, and they then settled. So about 10 years ago, the first DNA work was done on the Lembeh, and the initial DNA evidence said, if we studied the mitochondria in these individuals, which is inherited from the mothers, there's no difference between the Lembeh and the people who live around them. But if we look at the Y chromosome, there's a very distinct difference. The pattern that is seen in the Lembeh is not what you see in any of the African groups around them. In fact, the most dominant haplogroups among the Lembeh are the J haplogroups that were seen in many of the Kohanim. So when this evidence came out, there was a lot of publicity. If you Google it, you'll find in the popular press, there were lots of stories that was written about it. And the Lembeh themselves saw this as a justification and as a vindication of their position. But unfortunately, there isn't a happy ending here, in the sense that a few years later, better quality data came out, both for studying Kohanim in Jewish population, in mainstream Jewish populations, and in the Lembeh. And it turns out it's not quite so simple. Although the haplogroups that the Lembeh have are Kohanim, are J haplogroups, they're not the J haplogroups that are Levantine in origin, rather they are Arabian in origin. So the story of coming from Israel 2,500 years ago, that's not supported by the evidence. And of course, for the Lembeh, this is maybe a problem. If you're trying to define your identity based upon the DNA, you're going to be disappointed. I was asked about 3 months ago, I got an email from a Lembeh person who wanted to know where he could get his DNA tested. And I said to him, don't get it tested, because your identity shouldn't come from a DNA test. And I would say the same thing to someone who is worried about whether they're Cohen or not. If that's important to you, don't have a DNA test, because it doesn't prove anything. If you do the test and you are the right haplogroup, it doesn't prove that you're a Cohen, because there are lots of other people who are not Cohens who have that haplogroup. And if it tells you you're the wrong haplogroup, you are going to be very disappointed. So I'm not saying that one shouldn't challenge histories of groups, but I think there is a risk, particularly for groups who are being marginalized, that there is a problem. Now, this story that the haplogroups are Arabian in origin, of course, is an interesting one, because the history of Arabia before the rise of Islam was a very Jewish one. And we know there were lots of Jewish kingdoms in Arabia before the rise of Islam. And if I just go back a slide to this picture over here, right through the last 2,000 years ago, there's been trade from Arabia down the east coast of Africa. And this island of Dar es Salaam over here has been a major trading port. So although I'm speculating now, of course, their story is quite consistent of a Jewish group who decide to leave Arabia for either they're trading or they're refugees. They go to Dar es Salaam and then across by land over several hundred years, establishing themselves as they go along. So this is not completely contradictory of their story, but we start speculating rather than having solid scientific evidence. So the problem I want to say here is that if you are trying to use DNA evidence to manufacture an identity, it's deeply problematic. Identity at an individual level is not what DNA is for. So this takes me back to the Ashkenazi Jews, and we'll see perhaps similar issues with Ashkenazi Jews, because this is a very controversial and a highly politicized debate. So where did the Ashkenazi Jews come from? If you want to become an expert on the Ashkenazi Jews before the 9th century, you can probably do it in 20 minutes, because there's actually, factually, what's known about the Ashkenazim, there's not much known at all. Maybe that's a slight exaggeration, but there's really not much known about the Ashkenazim before the 10th century. Our first real records come from the 10th century. So in this region of the Rhineland, which today would be the western part of Germany and the eastern part of France, we start to see settled communities that we regard today as being Ashkenazi Jews. And certainly by the middle of the 10th century, we see a settled community. We see very famous rabbis writing in the 10th century. Rashi was born in 1040 in eastern France. So they settled, they write extensively, but they don't talk about themselves. So we don't have a history. They don't say where they came from. Very interesting why they don't. So where do they come from? So there have been a number of hypotheses. I have here my Encyclopedia Britannica from 1948 that I inherited from my grandfather, which says that Charlemagne invited the Jews from Baghdad to come to that region. Nice story, but there doesn't actually seem to be much in the way of historical or genetic evidence to support that. So today there really are only two hypotheses that have substantial support. One is known as the Khazar Hypothesis, and one is known as the Italian or the Rheinland Hypothesis. And they've become highly politicized because people use them in their arguments about the status of the land of Israel today and who owns the land. Now, in my view, it's completely misplaced because I don't see why the truth of either of these hypotheses really affects the moral or historical value of the claims of different groups to the land today. But nevertheless, I think it's hardly surprising that anything that can be politicized will be politicized. So these are the two hypotheses. So the first hypothesis is the Rhineland hypothesis. And it says that there's first a migration from the Levant, from Israel, from Palestine to Italy, probably over several hundred years. But by the first century of the Common Era, there's a substantial Jewish population in Italy and in Rome in particular. And I'll come back to that later on. Later on, as the Roman Empire Christianizes and then after it falls and there's increased persecution of Jews, people migrate northwards into the Rhineland. When and how that happens, we don't really know. There are some historical references, but we don't really have a good story about how that happened. But by the 10th century, middle of the 10th century, there are established communities in many towns in the Rhineland. Then, over several hundred years, particularly after the Crusades start, there's increased persecution of Jews in the West, and communities start moving eastwards into Poland and further east by the 15th century, so that by the 16th and 17th centuries, well into the 20th century, the overwhelming majority of Ashkenazim live in Eastern Europe, with smaller groups of Ashkenazim in the West. So that's the Rhineland or the Italian hypothesis. The competing hypothesis is known as the Khazar hypothesis. Now, when I give this talk at Limmud in Johannesburg, this is very exotic because it's so far away and many people haven't heard of Khazaria before. I know when I'm speaking today that there probably are some people in the audience who are living in lands that used to be Khazar lands, and you may well know, you probably know a lot more about Khazar history than I do. But for the benefit of those who don't, I'm going to give another very quick and dangerous history of the Khazars. So Khazaria was a land north of the Black Sea. It existed from, now there's arguments exactly from when, let's say from the 7th to the 11th century. And at its peak, probably from about here all the way across to the Caspian Sea. And for a good part of that time, it was the dominant power in this region, either directly or holding other groups to tribute. So what's interesting about Khazaria is that somewhere in the first part of the 9th century, one of the leaders of the Khazars, the Khazar king, the Bek, converts to Judaism, as well as a significant number of his nobles. Now, Khazaria was multi-religious and multi-ethnic through its whole history. So through this whole period, there were Muslims and Christians, but the elite in the Khazars converted to Judaism, and probably a reasonable number of common people did as well, although we don't know the exact numbers. So it's fair to say that Khazaria was a Jewish state for 150 to 200 years. and including the period when it was at the peak of its power. So the Khazarian hypothesis is that the core of the Ashkenazi are these Kazars who converted to Judaism, as well as a mixture of people who came from all over. So we had refugees coming from Palestine, from Italy, and there were strong trading routes to Iran. So there were lots of Persian Jews who came through and settled in Khazaria as well. So there were Jews from all over, and this then created a Jewish population in Khazaria. And when the Khazarian kingdom declined, when it was finally defeated by the expanding Russian power, of course, this is a very complicated place to be in the period because you're fighting the Arabs to the south, the Byzantines to the south, and also the expanding Russian power. Eventually, in the middle of the 10th century, they get defeated by the Russians, and within 100 years, their power has almost disappeared. So the theory, the Khazarian theory, is that the Khazarians then move northwards into this region of Russia and Poland, and then later on, they move eastwards into Western Europe. Very different story to the Rheinland hypothesis. So we don't have the time to go through the details of the arguments. I'm going to summarize them here. So the arguments behind the Khazarian hypothesis are as follows. First, the people who support the Khazarian hypothesis say that Yiddish is a Slavic and Turkic language that later acquired Germanic vocabulary as the population moved from east to west. Second, they use a technique in bioinformatics called GPS, together with certain assumptions of proxy populations. And what I mean by a proxy population, it's a population that we use to stand in for a population that we no longer have available. So for example, we will use Italian populations today as a proxy for what Romans looked like 2,000 years ago. And although there have been differences, actually that's a valid assumption to make. So because the people in favor of the Khazarian hypothesis use certain assumptions about the origins of certain of the proxy populations that are used today, like the Druze. And together with the GPS bioinformatics technique, they say the most likely origin of the Ashkenazi people is just to the northeast part of the Black Sea. The final argument they give, which is more against the Rheinland hypothesis, is that the Rheinland hypothesis does require a very substantial growth in the Ashkenazi population. I'll talk about that later. What about do people on the other side say? So they say there's very clear consensus that Yiddish is a German language that later acquired Slavic words as the population moved eastwards. That GPS is inappropriate and the assumptions on the origins of proxy populations are wrong. It's impossible to reconcile the mitochondrial data with the GPS technique. There's no sign of the Khazarian ancestry using standard approaches, and we can explain the Ashkenazi population growth. So let's look at some of the data in a bit more detail. Before I move on, maybe I should say where I stand on this. So I don't have time to give you a long argument, but I think that although the Khazarian hypothesis was a very interesting hypothesis, in fact, it was proposed by a former collaborator of mine, not a collaborator of mine, a former colleague of ours in the group. And I think it was well worth exploring, but the evidence against it today, I think, is substantial. I'm not an expert on the language, so I'm not commenting on the status of Yiddish, but I think, and the majority of people in the field would say today that the evidence for the Khazarian hypothesis, as exotic and as interesting as it sounds, is not substantial. And there really is, despite some open questions, there's strong support for the Rheinland hypothesis. So let's have a look at that. So I haven't spoken about the maternal ancestry. Now, this is an example where the story I'm telling today is different to what the story would be if I spoke 10 years ago, because we've got new data in the last 10 years that's overturned the ideas that people had 10 years ago. So here's an example where we see significant difference between different Jewish groups. Sephardic Jews, for example, the majority of the maternal founders of the Sephardic Jews, if we go follow the mothers backwards, we will find ourselves in the Levant and the Middle East 2,000 years ago. It's not true among Ashkenazim. The majority of the Ashkenazim, if you follow the mothers back 2,500 years, you find yourself in Europe and probably in South Europe. So here is a work that came out about 6 or 7 years ago, and people generally still today agree with this. No one seriously disputes these findings. If you look at the mitochondrial haplogroups, the mother's haplogroups, 80% of them are European in origin. 10% are clearly Middle Eastern in origin, and 10% we don't know. So at most, 20% would be from the Middle East. The majority is European, and the majority of that is Southern European and Italian. And that is quite consistent with the story that I told you before. There's a large Jewish diaspora through the Roman Empire, probably established by mainly, but not entirely, by men who are traders. It's very successful at proselytizing, remarkably successful. So we have, for example, a Jewish community in Rome by the 2nd century BCE. And by the middle of the 1st century, there are 30 to 50,000 Jews in Rome. So this is a strong argument for proselytism of mainly, but not entirely, Jewish men who move to Italy, take on wives. At some point, the community becomes inward looking and establishes itself and starts practicing endogamy. And that group probably established itself, we think, although the dates are not accurate, is probably before the fall of the Second Temple. If we look at the autosomal data, this is roughly the figures. There are disputes here and there, but I would say, except for the people who support the Khazar hypothesis, this is roughly agreed. That if we look at the Ashkenazim, about 47% of the ancestry comes from Levantine ancestry, about 1/3 from Southern Europe, and about 1/6 from Eastern Europe and from Western Europe. And this part over here is the least clear. We don't really know the proportions here. We can also discover answers about when and how big. So when we talk about how big, we can measure something called effective population size. We can study the DNA today, and we can go back in the past to different times in the past, and we can say, what was the effective population size at that time? Now, what do I mean by effective population size? If I have 2 unrelated people, effective population size is 2. If they have 6 children, we have 8 people, effective population size is still 2, because it's a measure of genetic diversity. So this is what we think is the best story we have from the DNA data. About 25 to 50 generations ago, there is an admixture between a Levantine population and a Southern European population. Sometime later, 25 to 35 generations ago, there's a severe bottleneck. The population drops dramatically, going to an effective population size of 350. So the real population, we don't know, probably not more than 10,000, might have been much less than that. Sometime after this bottleneck, about 10 generations later, there's admixture with West and then East Europeans. So admixture we're seeing in the Ashkenazi population is relatively old. Now, there are a lot of open issues. Reconciling this with history, is not so easy. For example, the timing of the bottleneck is very hard to understand. We know that about 800 years ago, which is when this bottleneck would have been, that it was a very difficult time to be Jewish. I mean, there were the plagues, for one, and there was huge persecution of Jews. There was people were forced to convert to Christianity, people were killed, people fled. So we know the population in Western Europe dropped dramatically, but we didn't think that it was anywhere near as bad as the DNA evidence suggests. If the bottleneck had been 300 or 400 years earlier, 9th century, 8th century, that would be completely consistent with what we know. But as late as the 13th century, it's an interesting new fact that we need to take into account. Then the consistency between the mitochondrial DNA and the autosomal results is a challenge, not in terms of the overall proportion, but in terms of the estimates of when the admixture took place. The autosomal evidence tends to imply that the admixture between the Southern European and the Levantine population was closer to 1800 to 2000 years ago, whereas the autosomal data implies it's closer to 1200 years ago. And then this question of what is the Western European contribution? What is the relationship between Western Ashkenazi Jews and Eastern Ashkenazi Jews? It's a very interesting one that still needs to be resolved. I think I've gone a little bit over time, so I think I'm going to skip most of this slide, and I'll move on to the future. So this is still an active area of research. I think as more data becomes available, we're going to get better answers. And not only more data, but better quality data. As DNA technology improves and becomes cheaper, we'll get good quality, high coverage, full genomes, which we can use to get a lot more information. And then one of the things that's proved to be really useful in understanding human history is ancient DNA, which would be DNA that can be extracted from bones that are hundreds or thousands of years old. And that would really change the way in which we view our history, if we could find it. Now, obviously, in the Jewish context, there are all sorts of religious objections, so that's a genuine problem. But at least there will be some ancient DNA of neighboring people that will come out. So in summary, I think DNA has revealed key insights into the history of the Jews. There are still lots of unresolved issues. We see that there is this consistency between cultural and genetic identity, but we shouldn't misinterpret it. We shouldn't overinterpret it. Genetic identity is not the same as cultural identity, and we can't use the one to define the other. There are challenges to self-identity. I would not recommend that someone who thinks of themselves as a Lembeh or as a Kohen tries to validate their ancestry through the DNA test. It's misplaced, and we certainly shouldn't be using it to define individuals. And I think that's where I'll take questions. I'm sorry I was a bit longer than I expected to be, but thank you for staying with me.
No, thank you so much, Scott. And I was waiting, to ask the question first. So when I lived in China, I obviously got interested in the history of Chinese Jews, and in particular the oldest community, the Jews of Kaifeng in China.
Yes.
Yeah, right. And then I'm a writer, so I'm for the novel I'm currently writing, I researched this community in quite length. And the first historical data that we have about the community is from 1163. I mean, this is like a document, so there are no like genetic things or anything like that. And my question is kind of a twofold question. First of all, has there been done any genetic testing on Kaifeng Jews?
I haven't seen it, and I do look for, it's not my area of research because I'm more interested in African genomes, but it is an interest of mine, so I do look for it, and I haven't seen anything on Chinese Jews. Right.
And the second question is that, the oral history or the documentative history of Kazan Jews, what we have, states that they were established, the community was established by people who came from the West. So, and, the West,
yes.
China would be the, yes. maybe, Baghdad or, Iranian Jews or whatever. And I was just, hanging on something that you said about the South Italian connection and what was happening with the Levantine and South Italy with this Italian female DNA. Would you say that there was a pattern in a sense where the Jewish male traders would go somewhere far-flung, right? And then they would have they would marry
yes.
local. Yeah, so they're
definitely. So the best example of that probably are the Indian Jews.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So the Bene Israel and the Cochin Jews, so two different Jewish groups in near Bombay and then further to the south. Those are very good examples where we can't be sure who we know the founders were men, and we can just assume that they were traders. We can't prove they were traders, but those would be very good examples, and I think that would describe it. I mean, it's interesting that you say about the Chinese Jews, because in fact there's a Khazarian link as well.
Yeah,
there was a very substantial trade. At one point, there were Jewish traders, the Radhanite traders, that were linking the West to China.
Exactly, yeah. So that is also very interesting. And one more thing that I wanted to ask you, you talked about Lembeh people, but also there is another kind of a crypto Jewish whatever group in Africa, which is a bit to the north, like in Uganda.
Yes.
So what's the story behind them?
Yes, so I don't. So there hasn't been, to my knowledge, any genetic history of those individuals. So they have quite a strong Jewish history, and they have a more complex relationship to the mainstream Jewish groups. There's been quite strong conversion programs that have taken place, and now there are established communities in Uganda. But there haven't been any genetic histories of those people. It would be fascinating to get them.
Well, and then, sorry, one more question really, about the Marranos, or, in the whole, Spanish Portuguese story. I don't know, maybe like, I don't remember the data correctly, but I read somewhere that around 25% of the current population of Spain and Portugal have some Jewish ancestry. So, what's the stand on that?
Yes. So there's been quite a lot of work on that over the last 10 years, say, of looking at what happened to Sephardic Jews, both before the expulsion, because of course before the expulsion there was mass conversion. A lot of Jews were forced to convert to Christianity before the expulsion. And then some people converted again to avoid expulsion again. So there's been a lot of work on that, both in Spain and Portugal. And so what you said is quite correct. There have been studies that show some significant levels of Jewish ancestry in Iberian populations, as well as work that's been done in some of the former Spanish and Portuguese colonies. Both in
South America,
in Latin America, and in Africa, in various places, getting different results. So yes, there definitely is some evidence of that.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm just checking chat. Пожалуйста, если кто-то хочет задать вопрос, I'm just switching into Russian, sorry. Если кто-то хочет задать вопрос, то чат у нас работает. И если вы хотите задать, просто напишите его в чате на русском языке или на английском языке. Если по-русски вы напишите, то я переведу. Okay, so I think everyone has been so fascinated by the discussion.
Yes.
Right, okay, good. So we don't have questions in the chat. Just let me check once more. No, I think everyone is digesting, because it's been such a...
Sorry, and it was a long talk, longer than it should have been, and it's at night as well.
Well, we have two questions. So you can actually look at the chat. Right, yeah, okay, so the Ethiopian Jews.
It's a more complex story, yes. So no, that I can't, it's not, I can't really give you a 2-minute description. So there's an example where there's different DNA, yeah.
So that's, would you, that is exactly the question I was going to ask. So there's a question about Bukhara Jews as well. So to summarize, are there any websites or any literature that you would recommend for the further study, even like self-study of this issue of the whole, issue of the, genetics of Jewish communities?
Yes, there are some, I mean, there are lots of websites, but I think you need to be a bit careful because this is a very controversial area. And so you'll find people who wanting to push a particular line. I don't know how easy it is for me perhaps to send you some references, and perhaps you could share them.
That would be great. That would be amazing, because people can just, look at chat and, see, some, books or websites that you would recommend.
Yes, so I've got a few, and the person who has written several books, and there are some papers on this that are free. There's someone called Harry Ostra. And then sorry, I'm going to give you the reference now if you just hold on.
Great, thank you. Yeah.
And there's one other I wanted to give you that was quite maybe that's a good enough start. Otherwise, it's a
right. Thank you very much. Well,
good.
Scott,
Okay.
That has been fascinating, and we wish you, on behalf of Limmud, we wish you the, success in your research, and we hope to see each other in a real life.
Yes, I look forward. I'll try to come to Limmud in person at some point.
Yeah, thank you. Большое спасибо всем участникам. И давайте мы немножко чуть-чуть подытожим нашу, так сказать, замечательную сессию. Во-первых, все проекты Limmud делают волонтеры. И мы очень гордимся тем, как мы слаженно и быстро работаем. Поэтому сразу после окончания сессии вы можете поддержать работу Limmud. После того, как мы закончим сессию, вы попадете на страницу Limmud Москва, где вы сможете оставить благотворительное пожертвование. А если страница не откроется автоматически, то можно просто зайти на сайт www.limmud2m.ru и сделать пожертвование там. Это, конечно, не обязательно, это добрая воля каждого, но очень приятно. И вы понимаете, что кроме наших трат для конференции у нас есть постоянные траты, которые мы все время несем. Это оплата склада, оплата хостинга, банковские расходы, поддержание сайта и, конечно, Limmud Unlimited, наша программа, в которой вы сегодня участвовали. Там нужно платить за платный доступ к трансляции, нужно обеспечивать качественный стриминг. Поэтому наша любая ваша помощь, она будет принята с большой благодарностью. И что касается следующих наших планов, перспективных планов, 27 мая будет финальная сессия, следующая сессия нашего проекта, последняя на настоящий момент. И это, наверное, очень интересная сессия, очень интересная встреча, потому что мы будем рассматривать, мы будем обсуждать один из самых популярных сериалов на Netflix в последнее время. Это Unorthodox, неортодоксальная. И сессия это называется «Свободный разговор о несвободе». И это уникальная встреча, потому что мы будем встречаться с 4 актерами сериала и с автором сценария. Поэтому это тот момент, который ни в коем случае нельзя пропустить. И наша сессия тоже пройдет на английском с синхронным переводом. Еще раз большое спасибо. Thank you, Scott, very much. I just, announced the plans and, summarized everything. And большое спасибо всем и ждем вас на следующих встречах нашего Limmуда. До свидания.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.